In 1986, a construction team working on a road project in Gansu Province, in northwestern China, broke ground near a hillside outside the town of Tianshui and exposed the entrance to a sealed tomb. The tomb was not exceptional by the standards of what archaeology had recovered from that region. The Qin state had buried its officials and administrators across the Wei River Valley for centuries, and chamber burials of this type were documented throughout the area. What distinguished this one was not its architecture, not its burial goods, and not the status of the person interred inside. What distinguished it was what was written on a set of wooden and bamboo strips found near the occupant's remains, and what was painted on a piece of material that had survived more than 2,000 years in the sealed, dry environment of the chamber. The tomb at Fangmatan contained maps, not decorative representations, not symbolic diagrams, not cosmological charts of the kind found in ritual contexts across the ancient world. These were cartographic documents, representations of specific geographic territory, with rivers, mountains, roads, and administrative boundaries rendered in ink on pine wood and, in one instance, on paper. The paper map is the detail that changed the record. Prior to 1986, the earliest confirmed paper artifacts from China dated to the 2nd century BCE at the earliest, consistent with the traditional account placing the invention of paper in the Han Dynasty, around 105 CE under the court official Kailuan. The Fangmatan paper fragment, analyzed after its recovery from the tomb, was dated to the early Western Han Dynasty, pushing the physical evidence back toward the 3rd century BCE, the period of the Qin state, before unification under the first emperor in 221 BCE. The fragment measured roughly 5 by 10 centimeters. It was small enough to fit in a palm. It had spent somewhere between 2,100 and 2,300 years in the earth. When conservators at the Gansu Provincial Museum examined it under magnification, they found that the surface retained visible ink lines, geographic features, still legible, marking the course of what researchers identified as a river valley in the territory that is now eastern Gansu. The lines were drawn with precision. The orientation was consistent with the terrain. Someone had looked at a landscape and translated it onto a surface thin enough to fold, light enough to carry, and durable enough to survive burial in a sealed chamber for over 2 millennia. The archaeologist who led the initial documentation of the Fangmatan tomb, working under the auspices of the Gansu Provincial Institute of Cultural Relics and Archaeology, understood immediately that the paper fragment required separate analysis. The wooden strip maps, 7 panels in total, covering a territory of roughly 470 square kilometers in the Gue River Basin, were already significant. They showed drainage systems, forests, roads, distances between settlements, and administrative divisions of the Qin state, with a geographic accuracy that matched the actual terrain when researchers compared the ancient representations to modern topographic surveys. The correlation was not approximate. The rivers were where the rivers were. The roads followed passes that are still used today. The person or persons who produced these maps had access to systematic survey data, measurements of distance, observations of elevation change, records of watercourse direction, that implied an organized cartographic practice, not improvised sketching. But the wooden strips had precedent. Documents on wood and bamboo were well established in the Qin and early Han periods. The paper changed the calculation entirely. In the decade that followed the 1986 excavation at Fangmatan, the wooden strip maps entered the institutional literature and drew systematic attention from researchers in the history of Chinese cartography. The comparison they undertook, placing the geographic features represented on the 7 pine panels against the actual terrain of the Gue River Basin, produced results that reshaped the scholarly understanding of what the Qin state had been capable of producing. The maps were accurate. Not approximately accurate. Not accurate in the general sense that a sketch made from memory might capture the rough shape of a valley, but accurate in ways that implied systematic measurement. The Gue River's course, as represented on the pine strips, followed the river's actual course with a fidelity that required more than observation from a single point. The tributary streams were present, and their junctions with the main channel were correctly positioned relative to one another. The roads marked on the panels connected settlements that existed along routes that followed the actual topography, passes where the elevation allowed passage, river crossings where the banks permitted fording. Distances between points, recorded in the numerical notation of the Qin administrative system, corresponded to real distances on the ground within margins that researchers considered remarkable for instruments available in the 3rd century BCE. The person or team that produced these maps had conducted a survey. That was the only explanation the evidence supported. Someone had walked the terrain, measured distances by pace count or rope, noted directions, identified watershed boundaries, and translated those observations into a two-dimensional representation at a consistent scale. The scale itself, once researchers established it by comparing map distances to ground distances, proved consistent across all 7 panels. This was not 7 independent sketches assembled after the fact. It was one coordinated document produced from a unified survey of a defined territory. What this implied about Qin administrative capacity became the focus of subsequent scholarship. The state of Qin, in the century before its unification of China under the first emperor in 221 BCE, was engaged in systematic territorial expansion, absorbing neighboring states, reorganizing their administrative structures, assigning them to a system of counties and prefectures, and taxing them accordingly. To tax a territory, administrators needed to know what it contained: its agricultural land, its forests, its roads, its settlements, its water resources. The Fangmatan maps were not curiosities. They were instruments of governance. They represented the ground-level implementation of an administrative apparatus that required precise geographic knowledge to function. Scholars working on early Chinese bureaucracy in the years that followed the discovery published analyses arguing that the Fangmatan documents should be understood not as isolated artifacts, but as surviving examples of a cartographic practice almost certainly widespread across the Qin administrative system. The 7 panels from Tomb 5 represented one district. The Qin state controlled dozens. If each required similar geographic documentation, and the administrative logic of the system suggested it did, then the tomb at Fangmatan had preserved a fragment of what was once a comprehensive territorial record of an entire empire. The rest of that record had not survived. The paper fragment recovered from Tomb 5 at Fangmatan was not the only object in that burial that required explanation. Among the wooden strip maps, researchers working through the institutional record in the years following the excavation identified a set of annotations that went beyond geographic notation. In the margins of several panels, written in the administrative script of the Qin state, were figures that did not correspond to distances or place names. They corresponded to quantities of timber, of agricultural land measured in mu, of road segments categorized by surface type. The maps were not purely cartographic. They were economic documents. They recorded not just where things were, but what those places produced and what it cost to move between them. This detail shifted the interpretation of the Fangmatan corpus significantly. A map that records timber yields by forest section is not a navigation tool. It is a resource inventory. It tells a central administration how much material a given district can supply, how far that material must travel to reach processing centers, and which routes are viable for transport at different seasons. The Qin state, in the decades before unification, was engaged in the construction of roads, canals, and military installations at a scale that required precisely this kind of information. The connection between the maps and the administrative machinery of the Qin expansion was not inferential. It was written into the documents themselves. Researchers who examined the strip maps in the 1990s in the context of other Qin administrative documents recovered from sites across Shaanxi, Hunan, and Hubei provinces found that the Fangmatan materials were consistent with a standardized system. Qin administrative law, partially recovered from a cache of wooden strips found at Shuahudi in 1975, specified requirements for local officials to maintain geographic records of their territories. The Shuahudi strips, dated to 217 BCE, included legal provisions governing the accuracy of official maps and the penalties for submitting falsified geographic data to the central government. The Fangmatan maps were not anomalies produced by a single unusually skilled cartographer. They were examples of a bureaucratic requirement, official products of a system that mandated geographic documentation as a condition of administrative function. What this revealed about the Qin state was something that the traditional historical record had not made fully visible. The texts that survived from the Qin period, including the records of the Grand Historian compiled by Sima Qian roughly a century after the dynasty's collapse, emphasize the political and military dimensions of Qin expansion, the conquests, the legal reforms, the construction of the early Great Wall, the standardization of weights, measures, and written script. What the Fangmatan maps added to this picture was the infrastructure beneath those achievements. Standardized weights and measures are only useful if you know where goods are produced and how they move. Road construction requires knowledge of terrain. Military campaigns require supply lines calculated against real distances. The cartographic system that produced the Fangmatan documents was the informational foundation on which the Qin administrative state operated. Chen Wei, an archaeologist at Wuhan University who has published extensively on Qin and Han administrative documents, argued in a 2001 analysis that the Fangmatan maps should be understood as part of what he described as the Qin information state, a governmental apparatus that treated geographic and economic data as strategic resources to be systematically collected, standardized, and centrally administered. This argument positioned the Fangmatan corpus not as an interesting archaeological curiosity, but as material evidence for a theory of early Chinese statecraft, that the Qin success in unifying a fragmented political landscape depended not only on military superiority, but on an informational advantage, the ability to know, with precision, what was in each territory it absorbed. The paper fragment complicated this picture in a specific way. If paper was available during the Qin period, even in limited quantities, even in early, relatively coarse form, then the assumption that paper was a Han innovation required revision. But the revision was not simply chronological. The question was not only when paper existed, but what it was used for and who had access to it. The Fangmatan fragment was found in a tomb. The person buried in that tomb had paper in their possession at a time when the historical record suggested paper did not yet exist. This implied either that the historical record was incomplete, which it demonstrably was, given that the entire Qin administrative archive had been destroyed when the capital Xianyang burned in 206 BCE, or that paper production in the Qin period was more developed than surviving sources indicated, but restricted to administrative or elite contexts that left limited material traces. The physical analysis of the fragment supported the second interpretation. Researchers who examined the paper under microscopy found that it was produced from a fiber base consistent with hemp or rami, plant materials that were available in the Wei River Valley and that were used in textile production throughout the region. The paper-making process required those fibers to be macerated, dispersed in water, and collected on a screen to form a thin, even sheet. The Fangmatan fragment showed a relatively uniform fiber distribution, suggesting a controlled production process rather than an accidental or improvised one. Someone knew how to make paper. The technique existed. What had not survived? Because almost nothing from the Qin period survived the destruction of 206 BCE, was the documentary record of where that technique was practiced and how widely its products were distributed. The implication was that the gap in the historical record of papermaking was not a gap in the technology itself. It was a gap in the sources, a consequence of the deliberate destruction of the Qin archive by the forces that overthrew it. The Fangmatan fragment survived because it was sealed in a tomb before that destruction occurred. It was not evidence of an early experiment in paper production. It was evidence of a practice that had already advanced far enough to produce a document fine enough to carry ink lines representing a river valley in eastern Gansu, and important enough to place in a burial alongside the official maps of a Qin administrator. The paper fragment from Fangmatan did not resolve the question of when paper was invented in China. It complicated it. And in the decades following the 1986 excavation, that complication drove a sustained re-examination of the physical evidence for early papermaking that had been largely absent from the historiography. The traditional account, Kai Luan, 105 CE, court presentation to Emperor He of Han, had been treated for centuries not as a hypothesis, but as a settled fact. The fragment from Tomb 5 made it impossible to treat it that way. The problem was not simply one of dating. The fiber analysis of the Fangmatan fragment placed its production in the Qin or very early Western Han period, which pushed the physical existence of paper back by at least 2 centuries. But that finding had to be understood in relation to what the Han tradition actually claimed. The story of Kai Luan recorded in the Book of Later Han compiled by Fan Yi in the 5th century CE, did not say that Kai Luan discovered paper. It said that he improved it, that he refined the process using bark, hemp waste, old rags, and fishing nets, and presented his method to the emperor. The distinction between invention and refinement, between first production and systematic improvement, had been obscured by centuries of condensed retelling. When researchers returned to the original text after the Fangmatan discovery, they found that the classical source itself did not claim what the popular account had long attributed to it. This meant the Fangmatan fragment was not in contradiction with the historical record. It was in contradiction with a simplified version of that record. The actual textual tradition, read carefully, left open the possibility that paper in some form existed before Kai Luan, coarser, less uniform, produced in limited quantities for restricted purposes, and that what Kai Luan contributed was the refinement and standardization of a technique already in use. The fragment from Gansu was consistent with exactly this reading. Early paper, functional but not refined, produced for an administrative purpose in a context where the material was available but not yet standardized across the imperial system. Lothar von Falkenhausen, an archaeologist at UCLA whose work on early Chinese bronze culture and administrative systems has been widely cited in the field, addressed the Fangmatan materials in a broader discussion of Qin material culture published in the early 2000s. Von Falkenhausen's analysis situated the maps within a pattern he identified across Qin and early Han sites. The systematic use of portable, lightweight recording media, silk, lacquered wood, bamboo, and in limited cases paper, by an administrative class whose function required constant movement of information across large territories. The maps were not exceptional products of exceptional skill. They were standard outputs of a standard bureaucratic function, produced by trained officials working within a system that had specified requirements for geographic documentation. What made them exceptional was survival, the accident of a sealed tomb in a dry climate, the durability of pine in anaerobic conditions, and the particular chemical stability of the ink used to draw river courses onto wood that had been cut and dried 2,000 years before anyone looked at it again. The wooden strip maps themselves continued to generate scholarship into the 2010s and 2020s as researchers applied new imaging technologies, multispectral scanning, X-ray fluorescence analysis, high-resolution photogrammetry, to the surfaces of the panels. These methods revealed ink traces and annotation marks that had not been visible under standard lighting conditions. Several of the panels contained secondary notations in a smaller script, added at a different time than the primary geographic content, that appeared to record updated distance measurements along road segments. The maps had been used. They were not produced for burial and placed in a tomb as symbolic objects. They were working documents, annotated over time, and then interred with the official who had worked with them, placed in the tomb because they had been his professional instruments, the tools of an administrative practice that had shaped the territory they depicted. The tomb occupant's identity was never established with certainty. No inscription survived that named the individual. The burial goods, including the maps, a set of bamboo administrative strips, bronze vessels, and personal items, were consistent with a middle-ranking Qin official, possibly a county administrator or a surveying officer responsible for a defined territorial unit. The paper fragment was found near the wooden strips, suggesting it had been stored with the maps rather than separately. Whether it was a draft, a working copy, or a specialized document produced for a specific administrative purpose could not be determined from the physical evidence alone. What the Fangmatan tomb preserved, in the end, was not a mystery. It was a glimpse of ordinary work, the records of a bureaucrat doing a job in a state that had decided geographic knowledge was worth systematizing, standardizing, and maintaining across a territory measured in hundreds of thousands of square kilometers. The maps survived because they were placed in the earth before the system that produced them was destroyed. The archive burned. The capital fell. The dynasty that had built the most sophisticated administrative apparatus in the ancient world collapsed within 15 years of completing its unification of China, and almost nothing of its documentary record came through. The Fangmatan maps came through because one official's tomb held against the ground for 2,000 years, in a dry corner of Gansu, until a road crew broke the surface in 1986 and found what the earth had been keeping. The Gansu Provincial Museum holds the materials today. The wooden strip maps are conserved and cataloged. The paper fragment is stored under controlled conditions. The research continues, and the questions the materials raise about the origin of papermaking, about the cartographic infrastructure of early Chinese statecraft, about what else the Qin Administrative Archive contained before it burned, remain open. Not because the evidence is insufficient to answer them, but because the evidence that could answer them fully no longer exists. It went up with Xianyang in 206 BCE, and what survived is what was already in the ground.